Welcome, everyone. I'm Professor Barlo Demirgardician of the Armenian Studies program, and I'd like to welcome you to this first presentation in the Armenian Studies program, Spring 2021 lecture series. As I said earlier, we are going to be recording and streaming this presentation live on YouTube, and then also it will be on YouTube. So I would ask you, if you do not want to be recorded, you can go ahead and turn off your cameras at this time. Otherwise, you may be recorded. And also, I'm asking everyone also to please be on mute, and please hold all of your questions until the end of the presentation. Our format today is going to be a conversation with my guest, Eric Hacopian. After we have our conversation, it should last about 30 to 35 minutes. I will be opening it up for questions. At that time, you can use the chat area, or you can use the reactions to raise your hand, and I will call on you to ask a question. Please make sure your questions are going to be brief and to the point, and please, it's not a place for us simply to give your own opinions in a sort of statement. We just want to hear questions, and then we'll try to do follow-ups and try to get in as many people as we can. Today we have a lot of students at Fresno State who are joining us. And for that reason, I'm going to give a brief background to our presentation today. This may be basic for some of our listeners, but it is for our students who are joining us today. So I want to do that before I introduce our guest today and before we start our discussion. The first Artsakh War, beginning in the early 1990s and ending in 1994 with a ceasefire, resulted in a defeat for Azerbaijan and the establishment of the independent Republic of Artsakh. The final status of Artsakh Karabakh and its recognition as an independent state, however, was not settled. And for the past 26 years, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, has attempted to negotiate a permanent peace with a final status for Artsakh, but again, with no success. On September 27, 2020, Azerbaijan, with the assistance of Turkey, attacked the Republic of Artsakh, attempting to solve the 26-year-old frozen conflict through force. This 44-day war ended with a ceasefire agreed to in Moscow on November 9th and implemented on November 10th. During the war, thousands of Armenian soldiers lost their lives, and thousands of Armenians in Artsakh were injured and lost their homes. Azerbaijan targeted especially civilian populations in Artsakh, pouring thousands of bombs into the capital of Stepanakert. But they also targeted houses of worship, schools, and hospitals, including targeting the Ghazanchelots Mother Cathedral in Shushi. Azerbaijan utilized the latest military equipment, including drones and satellite, and was assisted in their logistics and management of the war by Turkish military officers. Artsakh suffered a devastating blow when it was forced, according to the agreement, to cede 7 territories to Azerbaijan, including the city of Shushi. And this constituted more than 50% of the territory of the independent republic. For Armenia itself, the war has had a severe impact on the political climate in the country, and which has endured a major change since the 2018 Velvet Revolution. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, a signatory to the ceasefire, has been severely criticized for his handling of the war, with many calling on him to resign. This political crisis continues until today in Armenia and in Artsakh. For Armenians everywhere in the world, in the diaspora and everywhere, the end of the war and all of the subsequent political fallout has caused, of course, tremendous shock and disappointment. In the search for some answers to questions that many of us have about the situation, our guest today is Eric Hacopian, who has been a frequent commentator for CivilNet in Armenia, bringing his political expertise to answer some of the unresolved questions arising from the war. Today, Hacopian will discuss the situation, answering questions about the lead up to the war and also the aftermath of the war. He is a 30-year veteran of American politics, having worked on campaigns from the local to the presidential level, and he has been living in Armenia since 2017. So Eric, thank you so much for joining us today on this international presentation, which is stretching all the way from California to the East Coast to Armenia. Thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
So I talked about the war, and I think the first thing that we want to start talking about is simply the immediate consequences of the war and the aftermath of the war. I think in some of our discussions earlier and in some of your previous commentaries, you've called it one of the most disastrous moments in modern Armenian history. Could you just explain a little bit about what you feel might have been the most important consequences of the war, both militarily and politically?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, I want to apologize to everyone. I have a really bad cold, so I might not sound like my usual self. But I think the most devastating thing has been, there was an era of confidence and optimism here post the 2018 revolution. That was pretty much across the board, and in good parts of the diaspora. And this war experience and the defeat has sort of shattered that greatly. That's been the most noticeable thing as far as what it has done to us as a collective. Obviously, that's a universal thing, but when you get down to the specifics, this images of refugees leaving, Armenians being forced off their land again, losing Shushi, Hadrut, and those images that came with that, people huddling in their basement, things that we thought we had overcome, things that we thought will never visit us again, visited us in dramatic ways. And it reminded us of, the perils we face, the part of the world we're in, and most importantly, our collective failings.
And I think one of the things that's, of course, natural following any type of disaster or any type of loss in a war is the search for reasons. And of course, I know that this could be a very broad topic, but you've talked about some of the major structural flaws, both in Armenia and perhaps in Artsakh. And I guess we again can start with military, but can you tell us about a couple of these? What were perhaps two of the major structural flaws that led to this disastrous outcome of the war?
I think it's the lack of preparation, the lack of foresight, and the lack of professionalism on the military and the political leadership. So that is the most striking thing, the one institution that had a lot of credibility in this country was the military compared to other state institutions. And there was this myth that you had, a competent military that was capable, unlike other state institutions, could do the job. Well, we found out that's not true. So that's the most devastating thing as far as what we saw and what we expected. The second thing I would say is the diplomatic isolation and the failure of the country, in the sense that we were entirely isolated and had no friends. As I have said before, Azerbaijan has friends, we have acquaintances. And it tells you about, to a great extent, that diplomacy had been neglected or had failed throughout the last 25, 30 years. How a lack of thinking about the dangers that we're facing. Those were the two primary things. I mean, on the military side, I can go through a lot of specifics. As I have stated countless times before, I don't like to talk too much about specifics there because we frankly don't know, and there's too many people who speculate about things that they're not sure about, and they sort of talk about things that are not, they don't know about. As I've said before, there's been, we're a couple of, a decade ago, we're still learning things about World War II. And then you have people who sit around or stand in street corners and give you deliberate, exact, this happened here, this, this person betrayed here. So I think it's just two things. I mean, when you look at the military, it was a military that was not ready. It was a military that was ready to take on the army of Azerbaijan. It was not ready to take on the army of Azerbaijan led by a competent Turkish military command. buttressed by modern weapons, terrorists that they brought in, and a lot of other things. So it was a lack of preparation, lack of thinking. Logistics was a mess. I mean, the list of things that have come out or are coming out from people is amazing as far as the lack of foresight. And in diplomacy, it's sort of, how can the country be so isolated? How can we not try to at least, take advantage of the sort of become using our enemies to be helpful to us in this process? So those are the two big things I would say that really stood out for me.
And leading up to the war, the September War, of course, there were signs of what may have come because of public statements, both in Armenia and in Azerbaijan, about the situation. The situation had been frozen; it had not been successfully resolved in 26 years. So, in looking at this entire picture, do you see it as something I'm looking now specifically on the Armenian side, as something that, of course, predates the period of Pashinyan, going back to previous governments as well. So tell me a little bit about perhaps why there was an inability for previous administrations in Armenia to solve the issue.
Well, I think, there's a tendency to be, what I call both sidisms. Both sides are unreasonable. Both sides don't want compromise. Both sides don't want sacrifice their gains. And there obviously was some of that on the Armenian side. Anybody, if there was anybody that would have made a peace deal and would have, withdrawn from the occupied territories, the liberated territories, however you want to phrase it, would have been crucified by the public here. Whether that was the first president, the current prime minister, Kocharyan, or Eric Hacopian, they would have all gotten the same heat. So that existed on our side. However, there's been one obstacle to peace, and that one obstacle to peace has been the other side. And you don't need to, you can look at the facts. 2001, in Key West, Kocharyan essentially offered all of the occupied territories, except for Lachin, in exchange for independence for Artsakh. From what the stories are, the elder Aliyev accepted it, and he goes back to Baku and he gets talked out of it. 2011, by the way, the 2001 deal also had what they're building right now, which would be the road between Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan, which would have actually been sovereign Azeri territory under that deal. Then in 2011 in Kazan, Ser Sarkisyan had essentially the same deal that he accepted with an interim status for Artsakh rather than independence. And that was rejected. And I think what the war has shown us is Azerbaijan is not interested in compromise. Azerbaijan wants Artsakh back without any Armenians. And I can tell you, people who were progressives or people who run the peace camp here, no one believes any of that anymore. No one's going to go to any peace conferences or anything like that. As far as people to people stuff. That all of that stuff died during this war, and all the sort of the savagery of the other side and the sort of the terrorist nature of the state on the other side, whether it's the torture videos or anything of that sort, has sort of killed any peace camp that existed here. So we have to be careful about. You don't have to like the former regime or like this one. Our side has always been willing to make the deal, as painful as it would have been. The other side wants Artsakh back without Armenians. And they say so in so many ways. And then once they talk to a Western audience, they'll say the opposite. But that's what they really want.
They succeeded in forcing Armenia and Artsakh to come to at least the ceasefire in November. And that agreement, I guess the main part of that was the bringing in of Russian peacekeeping troops into that region. Mm-hmm. But it didn't really resolve anything. Can you just briefly talk about that November agreement and what were the sort of open-ended parts to it? In addition to the ceding of territory, but really just kind of the open questions it really didn't resolve.
No, it didn't resolve. And in fact, if you listen to the talks now, it's not, no one's expecting any of this, the status issue to be resolved. According to Aliyev, I smashed the status quo and I'm not going to give any status or anything. So they're not interested in any kind of a peace deal. In fact, they're going to try to marginalize the OSCE group as much as they can. And, continue, negotiating with the Turks and the Russians over this or that and try to not have the Western powers of Armenia be part of most of these discussions. Frankly, the deal, the people have to understand, there was no peace deal. That was a ceasefire. And the ceasefire was obviously devastating for our side because we gave up all of the sort of the defensive postures in places like Kalbajar that are important for the security of Artsakh. And even sovereignty over Lachin. We get the road through Lachin, but we don't have sovereignty over it. By the way, that their road through Syunik will have the same thing. It will be our sovereign territory, except the Russians will allow them to, they will man the road as their trucks come and go. So there's a lot there's more left unresolved than resolved, because there's the status issue is not dealt with. It's, there's a lot to be still solidified beyond the Russian peacekeepers being there and separating the two sides for now, and bringing the war to an end. And I don't want to downplay how important it is to bring that war to an end. I think as for people who lived here and had to deal every day with that, and every day at 10 o'clock at night, you would get unlike the other side, our side was a lot more honest about reporting our dead. They weren't very honest about reporting the progress of the war, but we were at least honest about reporting our casualties. And every day at 10 o'clock, you would see the names on every news station of everyone. And, half of the names are kids who were born in 2001 and 2002. So there's nobody here that's not glad that the war is not over. Okay, people need to understand that. But just to answer your question, I can't really give you a good question because there's so much that's left unresolved. We just know the few things that were resolved, And we also know by now the sort of the grander Russian play here, or what they're really trying to accomplish, which isn't all negative, but I think their focus is going to be far more on very practical things rather than dealing with the difficult things that no one is willing to compromise on.
Well, we just had then in January, the tripartite meeting of the Prime Minister of Armenia, the President of Azerbaijan, and the President of Russia in Moscow, which was apparently more targeted towards the economic questions of opening up borders. Did you see anything there that was anything new or anything that you have some comments on?
Well, I mean, I don't know if you saw the optics of that meeting. It was actually quite telling. You have, it was the equivalent of like the big boss calling the two small bosses to his room because he wants something done. And the two small bosses come in different sides of the room. They don't shake hands. They sit down. They agree to what the big boss wants and they leave. So that's really the gist of it. And it's very clear that what the Russians want to do is they want to create these economic relationships, road transportation systems through, for Armenia, through Nakhchivan to Iran, for Armenia through Azerbaijan to Russia, and for Azerbaijan through Armenia to Turkey. And they're doing this for multiple different reasons, because the way the ceasefire agreement is written, they get to control these access roads. They control the access road between Artsakh and Armenia. And they will control, I think it's that their interior police will control the road that will eventually get built between Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan going through Syunik. So they get to put their finger on the pulses of three countries, Armenia, Artsakh, and Azerbaijan. So they want nothing that will stop from these things being set up. Now, are these things bad for us? No, not at all. We need to be practical, and in the sense that we need to be ruthlessly pragmatic. And us losing our isolation is not a bad thing at all. So opening up these road networks, frankly, is more positive for us than the other side, because the other side has a lot more access to the world than we do. The part of the Russian play here is to marginalize Georgia, because by doing all these things, Georgia no longer becomes the hub, the transportation hub of anything. So they get to control the roads while they get to marginalize a country that's against them and problematic for them and aligned with the West.
And the Artsakh War, and even what you're talking about, always to me has seemed to indicate that we are not really just talking about one-on-one or two-on-one relations, Armenia, Artsakh versus Azerbaijan. Really, this is a regional issue and even a world issue. And what you talked about with Russia marginalizing Georgia probably has to do with Georgia's closeness to NATO and wanting to become closer to the West. And that brings me to Turkey and Turkey's involvement and its relative gain in influence versus that of what you just said with Russia. So how do you see Turkey's
Well,
influence?
we have to understand, this war would have never happened without Turkish support. And more importantly, the Azeri victory would have never happened, at least in the way that it happened or the scale that it happened, without direct Turkish involvement. People need to go back to July of 2020, and I'm very critical of the Armenian military and its performance. But in 2020, when there were border skirmishes in Tavush, the Azeri military was humiliated, even against what we know now is not a particularly effective Armenian military force. Our side seized important positions in neutral ground that prevented them from being able to continue to shell or shoot at our villages, in some of the villages in Tavush. And in the process, they lost a general. There were demonstrations in Baku. And at that point, Aliyev flies to Turkey and hands over the keys to his military to the Turks. And the Turks essentially took over the command of the Azeri military, along with bringing in thousands of their special forces. So without Turkish involvement, this war would have not started, and it certainly would not have had the conclusion that it did. And I think the key driver here is one person. It's Erdogan, who, for his own purposes, saw this war as an opportunity and saw our posture correctly in hindsight as being weak, where he can have a victory on the cheap. You fly a couple of thousand terrorists from Syria, you bring in your special forces, you take over your command, and you can have a victory on the cheap that will make the Aliyev regime entirely or greatly beholden to you, and actually be able to poke the Russian bear in what they thought was their backyard, and to have Turkish influence in a place where their direct influence had been marginal so far compared to the Russians. So what this has done is this has internationalized this area of the world. In some ways, it's actually made it part of the greater Middle East because of the type of war and the type of people that were involved with it. But at the end of the day, the big winner here, outside of Azerbaijan, who actually got what they wanted, was Russia. Because Russia was a much bigger winner here than Turkey. Turkey is going to get contracts. They can highlight their weapons. They'll build a base in Azerbaijan, which, frankly, is there to make sure that the contract and the work comes to them. It's the guarantee of payment, pretty much. And the Russians are the big winners in this because the Azeris never wanted. They were very proud of not having foreign troops in their soil, not to have foreign troops in their soil from two countries. The Armenians never wanted the Russians there because they know when the Russians come, they never leave and they play their own games. Between me and you, I don't think people in Artsakh care if they're actually quite pro-Russian. So I'm not I'm not that convinced that they're against the Russian presence there. At this point, almost everyone in Armenia is positive about the Russian presence in Artsakh. Let's just be clear about that, because minus that, the outcomes would have been even more disastrous.
And that brings up the security issue, because you just mentioned that the peacekeepers will probably be there for a long term for many Armenians. And I know in the diaspora in California, people are talking about, well, what's the security guarantees for what remains of Karabakh? Turkey has been posturing recently with sort of war games in cars with Azerbaijan. So is this all just posturing? Is the security of what is remaining, at least of Artsakh, secure because of the Russian presence?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say so. I mean, outside of those really the sort of the fumble down in that couple of villages down in Hadrut, I know people who come and go, and I haven't been there yet, but everybody I have acquaintances who came back from Artsakh, and they're all struck by the normality of it, of how normal everything is. The roads are clean, and there's no problems coming and going. It's all the bars are full, restaurants are full. It's a strange type of juxtaposition going what we just went through. So normality, and the one thing that people also universally tell me is how the Russian military had a terrible reputation until recently about how professional they've handled everything, and how they're managing these two sides fairly well, coming and going and preventing conflict. So I think there's people who sit there and they watch these exercises. I get these frantic emails from people who've never been to Armenia, and they're telling me, they've heard that Turkish tanks are right by Khorvirab, and I'm going like, Turkish tanks have been by Khorvirab for 100 years, because it's 100 meters from the border. And literally, you can look over the border and you can see their outposts and you can see their tanks. So there's a lot of this misplaced hysteria from people who are not here. But the likelihood of anything of that nature, especially against Armenia proper, is very low.
Let's move the conversation to talking about the repercussions of the war to the political situation, the current political climate in Armenia. We'll start with what has seemed to be an obvious sort of observation, was that immediately following the November agreement, that there was an uproar in Armenia. It's evolved in many ways, of course, but one of the most important was that many of the important figures in Armenia have called for the resignation of the prime minister. He is not resigned. There's talk about elections, snap elections forthcoming. So let's just try to unpack a little of that. My first question is, how did the prime minister avoid resigning? How was it that there pressure from the president of the country, the Catholicos, other significant figures, and yet he did not resign?
Well, listen, I think first thing, that night had a lot to do with things, to be honest. There's images of that night. That night, for people who were not here, it was all night. It was from 1 o'clock in the morning when this thing was announced till 7 or 8. It was pretty active in the streets. There was a natural level of people that came out that were against this ceasefire. You could disagree with them, but I think they were sincere people. But there was also very clearly an element of people that were directly tied to the old regime. Some of them, I suspect some of them even paid, that went and did some of the ugliness in the parliament, as far as beating the speaker up, sitting, taking selfies. It was an ugly, ugly scene. And I can tell you, those events that night scared a lot of people away from the opposition. Because if that's the opposition, we don't want them. So they actually lost a lot. They were much better off not doing any of those things that night. I mean, how he has survived, that's actually quite an amazing thing. It's because Normally, when you're the prime minister, you're the leader of a country, especially a democratic country that loses a war like that, you're gone. I mean, David Cameron lost the Brexit vote, and the next day he's gone, and that's not the same thing as a war. But I think there's one X factor here is as long as the alternative to Pashinyan, the current prime minister, is the old regime, he will stay. Because as much as people might be disappointed with him, angry with him, thinking he made mistakes, or even hate him, the overwhelming majority of people fear the old regime coming back far more so than him. That's the issue. So I think we need to have an opposition that is not tied to the old regime. And the moment we have that, I think he's going to become a lot weaker, and there'll be other characters that will come into play that can challenge him. But in the short run, if the alternative is the return of the old regime, he's gonna win with hands down.
Do you see any viable opposition sort of in the future, near future, in this political space?
The only person theoretically right now that could actually take that space would be someone like Sarkisyan, if he's interested in becoming prime minister, which I think he is, and if he can clearly distance himself from being seen as the front man of the old regime. If he's seen as anybody who's seen as the front man of the old regime is going to lose. And let's not forget that old regime, without having control of the administrative state, they have a hard time winning elections. Most of these people on the streets, on these 17 political parties, 15 of whom have 14 members, total, is in the last elections, which were seen as the only free and democratic elections that we've had in Armenia since 1991, all of them, except for one of the parties, couldn't even make the parliament by getting past the 5% threshold. And not much has changed in people's attitudes towards them.
And has the prime minister changed his, I don't want to say position, but after the war, how does he explain it? How is his justification? I mean, I've seen several of his explanations, I'll use the word, but it's not been consistent in my mind.
First of all, we have to make the point that the entire leadership of this country, current government, previous government, military leadership, they're all what I call a moral fail, because none of them clearly take responsibility for what led us to this moment. Now, Pashinyan, to his credit, has taken more responsibility than others, but the moment he takes responsibility, then he comes back 2 seconds later and blames 3 other people. But I don't want to hear that. I want you to take full responsibility for the mistakes that you made. Then you can turn around and blame other people. But there's a complete lack of, the revolution got rid of the culture of impunity in Armenia. We don't have that anymore, which is a good thing. But we don't have a culture of responsibility in which people take ownership of their failures. And Pashinyan made a lot of mistakes, most of them before the war, actually, to be honest, that led to this. The first thing is he should have known the state of his army, that if you have an army that's not ready to go to war, then you better be a hell of a lot more conciliatory than the diplomatic front and be far more aggressive there. So I think that's where we're at with him. He should, I have said this repeatedly, what he needs to do, I don't care if he holds elections, doesn't hold elections, and I think he should hold elections because we need new mandates, is he needs to broaden his government, and he needs to bring in people that are not part of his inner circle. Our politics in Armenia tends to be very clannish. It's you and your friends, and everyone else is an enemy. He needs to broaden his government and bring in people that are not even necessarily, direct political actors, but are experts in this field or that field. So what I would ask him to do, and I've asked him publicly repeatedly, is it doesn't matter what the opposition wants or how much you hate them or how much a lot of people don't like them. That's not relevant. You're the leader of the country. And your job is to see us through this crisis, and the only way you see us through this crisis is to broaden your base and to act as the leader of the entirety of the country, even the parts that you don't like.
And just talking about Armenia in the context of the larger world picture, of course, when Turkey got very much involved in this conflict, people were looking to France for leadership, the United States, Russia, because they were the OSCE chairs, co-chairs. And let's talk about the United States briefly. The old administration, the Trump administration, was very much silent on this whole issue. Perhaps you can just explain that. It may seem obvious for many people, but you can explain that. And then briefly, with the new Biden administration, is there some chance for a change in the United States involvement to become more involved and in this situation?
Well, barring the, I don't want to sound partisan because I worked in Democratic politics most of my life, but it's not a far-fetched to say that Trump's approach here was. I don't think there was an approach here. I mean, it was just a whole bunch of chaos, to be honest, and not. This is not a part of the world that they paid any attention to or cared about. And when the war started, they didn't. They acted in the same way. Do I expect more from Biden? I expect more from Biden in the sense that he will go back to becoming a normal American president, in the sense that the United States involves itself in every part of the world, and a normal administration, whether it's George W. Bush or Joe Biden or Barack Obama, they will re-engage in this area again. They will not neglect it like the Trump administration did, but in all fairness to the Trump administration, they neglected most of the world. So it's not like we were anything special. It's not that they even thought about us. So I expect a greater American engagement here. In fact, I expect that will also inevitably lead to a greater EU and Western engagement here, which I think is all for the good. The more hands involved here, to be honest. So the discussions are not just between a weak Armenia and Turkey and Russia and Azerbaijan, the better.
And you've recently posted an article called "The New Patriotism," the new Armenian patriotism, and I'm going to share that link to our guests, and they can take a look at that later if they'd like to, because of course we always want to be forward-looking and say, well, what can change? What is the positive ways that Armenia can change, Artsakh can change to lead to a possible long-term change? And you call this the new patriotism, the new Armenian patriotism, in which you mentioned 5 points. Perhaps you can talk about what you feel are a couple of those points that perhaps can help illuminate your way you're seeing a solution, a long-term solution to, but not only the Karabakh issue, but what's been happening in Armenia.
Well, I mean, listen, when I wrote this, it was not designed to be critical, or what our grandmothers and grandfathers and fathers and mothers believed in or fought for. It wasn't that. It's just to update it to our current times. And I think what we need to focus on is the basic things. We need to be able to take pride in building a functional country that has a functional economy that works for most people here. 1. 2, we need to create a competent state structure, which we don't have at this point. Most of our state structure is at best, mediocre and normally just entirely problematic or not helpful. 3rd is, military. We need to create a far more competent military, which is almost inevitably going to lead to creating a military industrial complex, which I think will actually be quite helpful in our efforts to bring science, education, and industry back to this country. And by the way, this is not some far-fetched goal. During the Soviet period, I think like 20-30% of all the design and programming work on Soviet weaponry used to happen here. So it's not like we haven't done this before, except we haven't done it for ourselves. And the other thing is to, look at places where, for example, where we have no islands of excellence, whether it's science, whether it's education. We need to create these little islands of excellence and to build on that and to sort of draw our attention to our nationalism that's not entirely focused on this land or that land, but making this into a functional country and a functional state that people want to live in, and something that people can be proud of. So we're sort of like looking internally and being critical of ourselves. And the last point there is culture. We have a very unique culture, which is probably our greatest strength. And there's many countries that use their culture to sort of, bind their different modernizations together. And we need to be able to hold on to that, not to be isolated, but to hold on to our uniqueness and to tell our story in our own way and not become just another spot in a homogenized world that looks like everywhere else.
I'm going to be asking you one more question in our conversation, and then for our guests, you can begin to ask questions if you'd like in the chat area, and then I'll start going through those questions after we have this final question in sort of this open conversation, and then I'll choose some questions and we'll begin to do that. So if you'd like to ask questions, use the chat area in the box on the right, and I'll be going through those as well as we go through the last section of today's conversation. One question is also, it's been asked several times in our chat today, also is about the status of Karabakh, because looking at it, going back in history, going back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when Karabakh was seeking its new status, a status, according to the Soviet constitution, they held a referendum, and that referendum overwhelmingly called for the independence of Armenia, of Artsakh or Karabakh. And then we went through the war and all of these other things. Do you see it's feasible that in the near future, Armenia will recognize, or any country in the world will recognize at least the status of Karabakh today, Artsakh today? And if not, then what is going to be the sort of long-term 5 to 10 year conclusion? Will there be another war?
I think there's variables here, because some of that depends on our actions, to be honest. We're not, we have agency and we have power to change things. In the short run, I don't see I see all of the current negotiations and anything going on with that having to do with sort of solidifying the current situation and sort of making Artsakh what it is, Russian protected. People can live their normal lives, hopefully, with security, without any kind of a settlement. That's the most likely outcome, because this part of the world is full of places like that. Whether it's Abkhazia, whether it's Ossetia, this part of the world is full of these unresolved issues that the powers that be, or the great powers, actually, for whatever reason, decide not to finally settle and put away. So I think most likely we're likely to have this gray area situation continue. We used to have a gray area situation prior to September 27th that was favorable to us, much more favorable to us. And now we're going to have a gray area situation that's not favorable to us. So I think that's the most likely scenario. However, there's nothing saying that if we in Armenia or in the diaspora do our job right and tell our story correctly, that we can peel off some countries who if they see, or we can convince them that Azerbaijan is not acting in good faith, we can move in that direction. History is not constant. Things change, and you have the ability to change things. But as a practical matter, I think in the short run, we're really the main goal right now is really to solidify the current situation, so people who are in Karabakh can live in security, or people who want to go back can go back and live in a secure place. As far as what's the likeliness of another war there, it's not very likely, because Azerbaijan has won the war. The people who win the war and the status quo is favorable to them have no great incentive to start a war. And the Russian political presence there, along with the Russian military presence there, makes it not very likely. If I was to bet when the next war in that area is going to happen, it will likely happen when the regime in Baku starts disintegrating or collapsing, if there's some kind of a political crisis there. That's the most likely time frame. And given the fact that Aliyev has won the war and has probably won himself 8 to 10 years, I don't see any, we're not likely to have a war. In this case, is in no position to start a war. So I think as not favorable as the current status quo is, we're probably going to be dealing with this for a lot longer than people would like.
Okay, now we're going to move to questions, and it's going to be a variety of questions dealing with some of the topics that we've talked about, and I'll try to get to as many as we can in the next few minutes. I don't want to keep Eric up too late in Armenia, and it's been really great conversation so far. But one question, it's a very interesting question. How do you see Armenia improving the cooperation between the global Armenian diaspora and Armenia itself, whether economic, scientific, maybe, as you mentioned, cultural?
Well, listen, the one thing I can tell you is there's a lot, this is an anecdotal example. Every of these summer programs that are for diasporans in Armenia, all of them are oversubscribed by a factor of 4 or 5. There's such a push for people to come here and do things. There's especially among a lot of young people that were never interested in anything Armenian. So I think we have actually just a great opportunity for a lot more engagement at a time where, unlike 20 or 30 years ago, Armenia is a different country. It's certain parts of it you wouldn't know. You're in this city in Europe or that city in Europe. So. And there's a lot of opportunities here for young people because, we have a government that's no longer corrupt. I mean, you can come here and pursue your dreams a lot cheaper than in other places. So what I would say is what's important is, one, for people not to give in to this nonsensical cynicism that's driven by this social media garbage, that's out there. One of the things that always amazes me with these people is what I call the Facebook fidais, these brave souls in different parts that, want wars to continue and all these things. Is there's enough bad news that is real. You don't have to make anything up, but they still insist on, making stuff up to make things worse than they are here. So I think the key thing is to stay involved. If you weren't involved, to get involved. Most importantly, to send work here. People say, this charity that no, you don't need to do that. I run a consulting business in California still, and I do all of my production work here. I don't do it here because they're Armenian. I do it here because they're good and they're cheap. People need to look, they shouldn't look at Armenia as a place where you do charity. You have to look at it as a place where you can engage, where you can make money, where you can send work to. And to help people raise their standards of living. And the other thing is raise their standard of work and expectations. So that's, I think, I'm not into these grand solutions. There's going to be some summit meeting between 50 important Armenians and they'll decide how we're going to, no, it doesn't work like that. Everybody has to own their little part of the sky and hold it up. You're a teacher, you do things with teachers here. You're a small businessman, you try to, have your accounting done here. It's those small things, everybody has to do their little part and not wait for these grand projects. The grand projects will happen, but you can't wait for them. And everybody should take responsibility for their piece of it.
And in terms of just the one-on-one relationship of Armenia and Artsakh vis-a-vis Azerbaijan, it seems like they really have to resolve in some way this long-term issue. Do you see any pathway for that? Would the economic opening lead to some sort of better relations, or is that just something that Aliyev wants to put out, and then he's still got his desires for what's going to happen?
Well, I mean, listen. First of all, you're dealing with a neo-fascist regime in Baku. Let's just be clear about it. You know, you're dealing with a regime that has made its entire state identity based on hatred of Armenians. So let's just be very clear about that, who we're dealing with. And it doesn't matter who the government here is. That's who they're dealing with. So you're not really dealing with, you know, Gandhi and Nelson Mandela here. However, that being said, when roads open up, businesses happen, things come and go, it opens up the possibility of reaching other understandings. At the end of the day, when all is said and done, whether they won this war, we won the one 30 years ago, and we win the war 30 years from now, at the end of the day, no one's going anywhere. And people have to reach some kind of an understanding that ends this conflict in a way that is fair or perceived to be fair by every party. And one of the ways to do that is not to look for what I call complete victory. You're not going to get everything that you want. You know, we won the war in '94, but we lost the peace. They won the war in 2020, and they could lose the peace. So at some point, we're going to have to reach some kind of an understanding. I'm not optimistic about it in the short run, just because I know the nature of the regime there. You're dealing with, if you look at the way they acted on the way of the signings of the agreement, it was something out of, Hitler going to Paris to revenge what the French did to him in World War I. Let's all get on a conference call and sign this thing. Really? Is that necessary? So we're not dealing with people particularly goodwill. However, there's a lot of history of countries that have despised each other, fought horrible wars against each other, and 50 years later, they don't have that kind of relationship anymore. You don't have to go very far, Between 1870 and 1945, Germany and France fought 3 wars that killed multiple millions of people and devastated both countries. And 20 years after World War II, that was unimaginable for them to ever go to war again.
Good. Another question, going back to Armenia's internal politics, the opposition, of course, everyone's calling the opposition wants the prime minister to resign, but has anybody in the opposition come up with any concrete proposals as to what to do going forward? And then there was one particular question about Sasnat Zorer, the group, and what is their role and what's happening with them? So just in brief about the opposition.
Well, the Sasnat Zorer, I don't know much about them except for the police siege. Most of them seem very sincere people, but they're quite a marginal figure here. I think during the elections when they ran, I think they got 1.5% of the vote, so they're not particularly relevant. They had, by the way, one of the greatest platforms I've ever seen of a political party. It was like the Tea Party meets Armenia meets Garigin Nishde. They wanted in the constitution the right to armed revolt. They wanted to do away with banks without saying, well, we'll replace them. So they were actually I actually found them fantastic. But they're a marginal group here. As far as what vision the opposition has, no, they have no vision. Their vision is, Nikolza Davachan, he needs to go. But in all fairness, the current government doesn't have any particular vision either, except they're against corruption, which is good, and therefore reform, and for clean government, which is good. But vision and Armenian politics is something that at this point does not go together.
So we talked about Russia, we talked about, of course, Azerbaijan and Turkey, but we didn't talk about Armenia's neighbor, Iran. And also we talked a little bit about Georgia, but and Georgia was not particularly, what's the word for it? They did not particularly support the Armenians in this conflict.
No, they were entirely aligned with our enemies. Let's be honest.
Okay. Good. So can you tell us what do you think about relations with Iran? Where did Iran stand in this? And we know that they have their own internal problem with northern Iran and the Azeri population there.
I suspect we won't really know what happened with Iran during the war for 15, 20 years until the current people are out of office and they start writing books. The Russians do everything and they blow it up to the world. The Iranians do as much and they don't ever talk about it. So there's a lot of strange things that happened during the war. They were certainly not against us. How much they were for us, that's really the question. I think there were weapons that came in through Iran, that's for sure. We know that as a fact. And we also know that the old status quo was quite favorable to them. They did not necessarily want a longer border with Azerbaijan, because a longer border with Azerbaijan means a longer border in which the Israelis can spy on them. So, but are they pro-Armenian? I wouldn't say that. Everyone's pro themselves, except of all of these countries, they were one of the few ones that were not actively against us. I'll say that much. The Georgian state, it was very clear during the war, is they've essentially been co-opted and bought out by Turkey and Azerbaijan in so many ways. And minus Western pressure from the EU, they would do whatever that they want. And they allowed all kinds of, if it was not for them allowing the constant resupply of weapons, this war could not have gone on and would not have had the same conclusion. So as far as I'm concerned, they were aligned with our enemies very clearly. And we should not kid ourselves about that.
Here's another question. It goes back to what we were talking about with the Turkish army that was, of course, massing at the Armenia border during even the outbreak of the Karabakh War. So I guess the question is, that the person is asking is, was that perhaps a reason that the Armenian army was not, all of the volunteers were not sent to the Karabakh front, because there was some concern that Turkey would...
No, the reason that a significant number of our troops were in Armenia, because Armenia has significant borders with Azerbaijan, both in Nakhchivan and in Tavush. And if there's any break in the Nakhchivan border, tanks can be in Yerevan in an hour and a half. So, there's a lot of this, I'm not a military expert, but, it's like, Pashinyan left bayonets in Armenia. Well, yeah. What is he supposed to do? Leave the country undefended? I mean, that's just elementary. So there were always going to be some level of armed forces that were going to stay here to guard our current borders with Azerbaijan, where there wasn't fighting going on. So no, I think this Turkish thing, to be honest with you, I don't even know where some of this comes from. Some of it is just Turkish propaganda, where they like to really mess with our heads, or Azeri propaganda. I mean, you have to understand that Turks cross that border, they're triggering a war with Russia, okay? That's the last thing they want. It's not about Armenia. It's not about them liking us or hating us or anything like that. It's the realities of what will happen. And they have no reason to invade Armenia.
Okay. And one of the final two questions I'm going to ask deals with diplomacy, and it was a question which has been asked. So Armenia, we know, is in an area of the world where they don't have too many friends. So the first question is, how do they gain better friends? And I think that, for me, ties into their diplomacy. And you mentioned that earlier. And especially, I was just reading that there may be a possibility that the new United States ambassador, that is the new Armenian ambassador to the United States, may be a top member of the political party that the prime minister is in, but she is not a diplomat. So can you give us what is the prospect there?
I wrote about this yesterday, and I was reluctant to write about it because I don't know her as a person. So there's nothing saying that the best person to represent your country is a diplomat. Sometimes the top political person is the better person. However, I can tell you that's probably not the case here. She's probably being chosen because of her personal loyalties to prime minister, which is not the reason you want to choose a prime minister, an ambassador to the most important country in the world. You need seasoned diplomats that have experience, that have earned being sent there, not because of loyalty. So I was very critical of that. Not speaking of her personal qualities, because she could be wonderful in 20 other things, but that doesn't mean she should be our ambassador to the United States. Diplomatically, listen, it's all a fail. I mean, where do you even start? I'll give you a perfect example, and I've spoken to this before. The UAE, a month before the Karabakh War, the UAE bombed and destroyed a Turkish air base in Libya. Okay, this is not even conjecture. They used a French jet that only two countries have, France and them, and it was highly doubtful for it to be France. Well, you would think our diplomats would think about flying to the UAE when this war started, saying, if you're willing to go all the way to Libya to kill Turks, we can make that a much shorter trip. Did anyone go to Abu Dhabi or Dubai? No. In fact, the only person who went there was Armen Sarkisian after the war ended. So if me, as a civilian, can put this two and two together, I'm not a diplomat, you would think our diplomats or our foreign minister would have put that together. Now, it doesn't mean that this would have worked. It doesn't mean that it would have been successful. That's not the issue. It's a question of what's your mode of thinking. How do you approach these things? How systematically do you approach them? And one good thing that I can say is right now, and I'm involved in some of these things, there's an effort to sort of build a think tank structure here that's focused on foreign policy that should hopefully up our game in the long run.
Thank you. I think we're going to end here because we've really taken a lot of Eric's time, and I know he's not feeling so well. But
if you have one or two more extra questions, go ahead. We're already up anyway, so there's not much point.
Okay, good. So all right, well, we're going to ask then one more question, and then we are going to end today because we do have a lot of questions coming up, and I'm just looking through a couple more of them here to see which one we can ask again. A lot of people, it's just, again, a lot of it comes down to when are we going to really find out about what happened in all of its ways? Because some people even suggest that maybe Turkey and Russia were actually pre-planned all of this in a way to divide up everything, and then that the prime minister had no choice but to go along with it. So again, when are we going to find out more about what's taking place?
Well, I mean, that kind of conjecture you're never going to find out about. First of all, I don't believe that to be the case. Our people love conspiracies. Sometimes things happen and people take advantage of it. I mean, this war in many ways was a black swan event. I can tell you there's a reasonable chance that if COVID hadn't hit, oil prices don't go to the dump, we don't have a war. So what happened is this is a black swan event for almost everything lined up against us. And that showed our system fragility of how weak we really were and how we were not ready. But that's our fault, no matter what anybody else tried to do to us. So I think that's on that level. I forgot the first part of your question.
Just about the Turkey and Russia working together, and the whole question of, again, this conspiracy and
okay.
they just allow them to come in.
Generally, most conspiracies, they have a little bit of truth, and that old line about a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. A lot of them lead from that. Mm-hmm. I think where we want to know the truth mostly, frankly, is, and I've said this many times, is we want a truth commission that looks into the war. That's going to come back and tell us exactly what happened, not for the purposes of blaming people. Obviously, there were plenty of people who screwed up. And I can give you my guesses about, all the mistakes that were made. But we need to have a clear look at what happened critically. And then after that, we need to have that same commission give us the guidelines of improving and reforming the military. That's, to me, task number one.
Well, my final question, and we are going to end with this question, and I think it's a good question because it really ties into what we're talking about. Where do people go to really get good, accurate information about Armenia? And one example was that during the war, we were being told information, Armenia is doing well, and we're fighting and back, and then all of a sudden it all collapsed. Can you give us a couple of places that you might have our listeners, our audience go to, where you think that there might be good, accurate information. Doesn't have to be opinionated information, but just sort of factual about what's happening.
Well, I mean, as far as English language stuff goes, I would say HETC, the HETC website, HETQ website. I would say CivilNet, obviously, being the biggest one of them. I would say EVN Report, and Armenia Liberty, which is the US government one, as long as you can filter through the government angle out of it, as far as factual things go. Unfortunately, there's just so much garbage out there put out by all kinds of people with these half-truths, half-rumors that are just designed to cause confusion and panic. And I would just tell everyone, be skeptical of everything you read from everyone, even from the sources I told you. Think for yourself, and don't panic over idiotic social media posts. Because more often than not, if I were to tell you the kinds of emails that I've gotten over the last 3 or 4 months, it'll be the comedy hour as far as the kind of things that are out there.
Thank you very much. Our guest has been Eric Hacopian. I've just posted for everyone a bit.ly Armenian Studies YouTube link where you can go to see this again if you want to have friends go and watch it. We have recorded this on YouTube. Eric, thank you so much for joining us for this really quite interesting presentation. For our guests, next Saturday, which is February the 6th, at the same time, we're going to have Dr. Vahram Shemasian speak about his new book on the Armenians of Musada. This is a fantastic work, and he'll be speaking about that. And you can follow us on Facebook and on our website at Armenian Studies Program. And thank you all. And we'll see you all at another time. Thank you and good evening, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.